What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Saboomtig down there on the YouTube.com. We like magic, and today I'm bringing you a long-awaited, apparently, budget deck. A lot of you want to see 8 Alchemists. In case you haven't heard of this deck, it's a really fun and sometimes fast mono red deck that's capable of doing a bunch of damage all in one fell swoop. And best part is it's only about 20 bucks on TCGPlayer. Not a whole lot of money, and if you're interested in checking that out, click the link in the description. But without further ado, let's check this deck. But why is it called 8 Alchemists? Well, Hour of Devastation came out, and because of that set, we now get to play 8 copies of thermo-alchemist, basically. 4 copies of Firebrand Archer, and 4 good old-fashioned thermo-alchemists. Well, there are pros and cons to both of these. Thermo-alchemist can block small creatures, at least in the early game. He can absorb shock and magma spray. Firebrand can't do that. And he's a point of damage every turn, no matter what, something that Firebrand also is not. But Firebrand can sometimes get through for 2 points of damage during combat, which is actually really important some of the time. But we're not too worried about what these guys can do during combat. We're mostly worried about their ability to just ping the opponent over and over and over. The Thermo-Alchemist deck was already pretty good, and now that we have 8 copies of Alchemist, more or less, it's that much easier to get 2 or even 3 of these things into play at the same time. And once you cast any spell, then suddenly you're bolting the opponent. And if you do that enough, they'll die. If you just have like any combination of Firebrand Archers and Thermo-Alchemists in play, if you have at least 2 of them, then 10 spells is your opponent's entire life total. And this deck is focused towards drawing as many cards as possible for as little mana as possible. Yes, of course, we play a whole bunch of burn too, but the deck also has the ability to cycle through cards really, really fast, and if you have multiple copies of these guys out, then you can kill pretty quick. We've only got room for like 1 more creature in this deck. I want the majority of the deck to be spells, but also definitely want to play Soulscar Mage. Would not be caught dead not playing this card. Well, in a deck that's playing essentially 30 spells, definitely going to play Soulscar Mage. We're playing a bunch of burn. He obviously works well with that, so we'll play him for that reason too. Sometimes he can get in for like 4 or 5, and that much damage can really, really make the difference over the course of a game. If you get in with him for 3 a couple of times, well, then you've essentially spent 1 mana on 6 damage or more sometimes. So Soulscar is definitely worth his slot in the deck. We don't have a whole lot of room for creatures, but if we're going to even run 1 more creature, he's the guy. Let's take a look at our spells, which is the entire rest of the deck here. We're going to play like 30 of them, and we'll start with the burn in the form of 4 copies of Shock. Definitely want to play Shock. Feel like it's a no-brainer. We want to spend as little mana as possible and play as many spells during our turn as we possibly can. And we also want all of our burn, if we possibly can help it, to deal damage to the dome when we need it to. And Shock definitely helps out there, 1 Shock with multiple Archers or Alchemist out can end up doing like 4 or 5 damage. So definitely want to play as many copies of this as we can. Also worth noting with Shock and the rest of our burn here, that early on in the game when we've got an Archer or a Soulscar Mage out, we can obviously just pop one of their creatures, get it off the board, and then attack with a bigger Soulscar Mage or get Firebrand Archer through, clear the way for him. So burn serves multiple purposes in this deck. Against smaller aggro decks, you're going to want to pick off their creatures a lot of the time so that you can survive until the mid or late game when you can really get a plane going with your Archers and Alchemists and such. But against, decks that don't play a whole lot of creatures or control decks, you want to just go to the dome as often as possible. More burn. We're going to play 4 copies of Incendiary Flow in the deck. One of the best burn spells in the whole format. It usually gets overshadowed by all-stars like Harness Lightning and now a Braid, but we want the ability to go to the face when we have to, so Incendiary Flow is a perfect spell for us. And of course, if we've got multiple Archers or Alchemists and stuff out, we can deal 5 or 6 with an Incendiary Flow sometimes. For just 2 mana, that's the best deal imaginable, and worth noting that this can exile stuff, so that helps out against zombies and such. We kind of suck against zombies sometimes because, we can shock that Dread Wanderer all we want. It's coming back, so Incendiary Flow helps out against that deck. I'm going to play 2 copies of a Braid in this deck, just as something else that can take out, medium or small creatures for just 2 mana, deal a little bit of damage off of our Archers and Alchemists and such, and also, importantly, kill things that we cannot kill with the rest of our burn, like Heart of Kiran, that's above all of our burn. Torrential Gearhulk, that's above all of our burn. We can even kill like a Colossus with this and pretty much everything else in that entire deck. So really important card in the standard. We're going to play 4 between this and the sideboard, but only 2 in the main deck. And probably the most controversial decision in the deck, 2 copies of Blur of Blades, but hear me out, this card's kind of awesome. A Blur might seem a little narrow, but I've actually got a list of some of the creatures that it takes out in this format. Important creatures too. Against zombies, it kills Cryptbreaker, Metallic Mimic, Dread Wanderer, that's important. Against other decks, it kills Champion of Wits, shaping up to be an important creature in the standard. Toolcraft Exemplar, Bowmac Courier, Expedition Envoy, Dragon Master Outcast, Glorybound Initiate, that's important. Falcon Wrath Gorger against the mono red aggro deck. Selfless Spirit, that's cool. And Glint Sleeve Siphoner, a card that's seeing a lot of play. It also kills a bunch of tokens, like a Catcher's Monument tokens. So, like, this kills a lot more than you might think it kills and deals 2 incidental damage to the opponent, which can sometimes translate to 4 if we've got, like, creatures out like Alchemists and Archers. So, like, Blur of Blades is a lot better than you might think, and it can even make guys that have 2 or 3 power a little bit slower so that you can win the race. Now, almost the entire rest of the deck, save for 2 cards, is cards that draw us a card for 1 mana. We prioritized that. There were 16 of those in this deck. But hear me out, and we'll show them to you one by one, starting with Spark of Creativity, which we're going to play a playset of. Now, this is a seldom seen card, right? I'm not really sure how many people have tried to play with Spark of Creativity, but in these mono-red and even blue-red, like, spells decks, this card is actually pretty strong, and it's gotten a bad rap up to now. I mean, it's basically a mana to sort of draw a card. That's cool all day. We want to do that in this deck. And sometimes it can kill a guy, too. That's nice. It can also add damage to a shock or incendiary flow that's in our hand, you know. We always want to choose the creature and go ahead and cast Spark of Creativity first before we cast our direct damage removal. So we never know what's going to happen with Spark of Creativity. But if you do get a land off of it, you can play that land. That's kind of important. Make sure that you play Spark before your land drops, too. Important to note that your opponent doesn't necessarily have to have a creature in order to be able to cast this. You know, we can target one of our own guys. That's pretty cool. And just elect to not deal damage to it. Just cast the card instead. It's totally fine. We're also going to play 4 Renegade Tactics in this deck, a card that I've actually been pretty sweet on since I first saw it. I like this in mono-red aggro decks. Just 1 mana, replaces itself in your hand, draws us that card, you know, and keeps a creature out of combat for the turn. Any old creature we want to, for just 1 mana. That's nice. Sometimes this can clear a path for Firebrand Archer, dealing a total of 3 damage at least. You know, get in with Archer, and when we cast this, we'll deal a damage with Archer, so that's cool. And sometimes it can get like a Soulscar Mage through. That's like relatively big too, especially in the early game when our opponent won't have a whole bunch of creatures out. This could be a really good card for getting in 2 or 3 extra points of damage. And just like Spark, by the way, this requires a target in order for us to cast it. But also, just like Spark, we can target one of our own guys. A little unintuitive to target one of your own dudes. Like, my own guy can't block on my turn. But still, you can do it if you just want some damage off of your creatures, or you just want to draw a card for a mana. You often want to do that. We're going to play 4 copies of Crash Through as well in this deck. Now, this doesn't require a target, which is fairly rare for red spells that only cost 1 and draw you a card. This doesn't require a target. We can just cast it no matter what the board state is. That's pretty cool, and this can get through big Soulscar Mages and stuff too, so that's important to note. And finally, 4 copies of Expedite in the deck. That is a total of 16 cards that can draw us a card for just 1 mana. I guess Spark, quote-unquote, draws us a card, but still, you know what I'm saying. But in any case, this can give haste to Thermo-Alchemist, which can be important. It can also give haste to Firebrand, you know, just get in with your Firebrand for 2 on certain boards. That's nice to be able to do. And it essentially does 3 damage in that instance. So drawing the card is what we're really after here, but at least you can sometimes go ahead and play your Alchemist, Expedite it, tap for damage, draw a card. All that's cool. Now, the main benefit of playing all of these things that draw us a card for 1 mana is obviously that we can chain them. You know, we can draw a card, draw a card, draw a card. We've only spent 3 mana. And if we've got a couple of guys out that deal damage whenever we cast a spell, we've suddenly done 6 and drawn 3. That can be really, really nice. And sometimes, you know, you'll play a couple of 1 mana draw spells, and then you'll play an Incendiary Flow. And again, if you've got a couple of Archers out or something, you've just done a bunch of damage, like half their life total in that turn. Also, this is important, playing this many cheap card draw effects allows us to keep the land count really, really low, which we want to be able to do, you know. We don't want to get stopped by drawing a land on turns where we're really looking to draw gas, so that we can keep chaining these spells and dealing damage with our Archers. And the final card in the deck, we're just going to play 2 copies of Insult to Injury, which is actually a finisher for us some of the time. Well, this card does a lot of stuff in this deck. The sort of ancillary stuff is that if you've got like a 4 or even 5 power Soulscar Mage and you've cast like Crash Through or Renegade Tactics or something, you can get through with that Soulscar for like 8 or 10 damage because of this insult. That's pretty nice. Or if like Firebrand Archer can get through during combat, suddenly he deals 4 damage. That's awesome. But the main attraction here is obviously that Archer and Alchemist can suddenly deal 2 damage now. Now, a common setup with this is, let's say we've got 4 mana and 2 Firebrand Archers, just for the sake of simplicity. We got 2 Archers. Now, if we cast an injury into a shock, we can deal like 10 damage all for just 4 mana, you know. You'll cast the Injury, that'll deal 2 damage because you have 2 archers out. And then when you cast your Shock, the Shock will deal 4 damage, and then the 2 archers will do 2 damage apiece. That's like 10 damage. That's pretty good. Another easy setup to deal a bunch of damage off of this is, let's say we just have like 5 mana and 1 archer out. You know, we can cast Insult into Incendiary Flow and deal 9 damage that easily. Insult will deal the damage because of Archer just being out in the first place. Incendiary Flow will deal 6, and then Archer will deal 2 because we cast the Incendiary Flow. So 9 damage for 5 mana ain't half bad either. Just Insult really lets us have some really explosive in-game plays. And we can finish the game on turn 5 because this card's in the deck. And I don't want to leave Injury out here, by the way, because it can be a little bit of reach as well. If we've got a couple of archers out, well, then suddenly we can ping a guy and deal 4 to our opponent. That's good reach. Now, because of all of our 1 mana draw a card spells in this deck, and the fact that Spark of Creativity can play lands, that's pretty cool. We're able to drive the land count down to 18 in this deck. There's only 2 cards in the whole deck that cost more than 2 mana. So we play pretty efficiently. We only play off of 2 or 3 lands a lot of the time. But we can get 4 and 5 lands out because of all of our draw a card spells, you know. And that's when things like Ramunap Ruins come into play. This is yet another piece of late game reach for us that can help us close the game out. And sometimes you can even deal 4 or more damage depending on what else you've got out in the way of deserts. Like Sunscorched Desert, you can sacrifice that to your Ramunap Ruins and still have your ruins out to deal more damage later. That's important. And also Sunscorched Desert, being able to deal 4 damage in total over the course of the game, you know. Like, we have 12 damage in our mana base. It's pretty crazy. If we cast something like Insult and then play our Sunscorched Desert, well, that's 2 damage. We've just doubled our damage with a Sunscorched Desert. So I just really don't want to underplay how much damage is actually in this mana base. But here's your sideboard right here. We're going to play Magma Spray against decks with smaller creatures, yes, but notably against zombies. Again, we want as many ways as possible to exile those and never have to worry about them again. We're going to play Blazing Volley against the Oketra's Monuments decks. They're going to have a bunch of 1 toughness tokens on the board throughout the game. And also, if we play an Insult into a Blazing Volley, then we can often wrath our opponent's side of the board against Oketra's Monument. So that's really important too. And it's only 1 mana, so it helps out things like Thermo-Alchemist. So we'll play that. Chandra's Defeat is in there because it takes out one of the most played Planeswalkers in the entire format, Chandra Torch of Defiance. And it also kills Glorybringer before, because it's an instant, that's important, before its Exert trigger. So, actually a really important card in this format right now, I think, for red sideboards. We're going to play that. We're going to finish off the playset of Abrade as well against artifacts like Heart of Kiran and Torrential Gearhulk. Important card. And also 3 Harsh Mentor in this deck against things with activated abilities. There are actually a fair amount of those in Standard right now. And here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 57, not half bad for a deck. That's only going to cost you maybe a little north of $20 on TCGPlayer right now. There's not a single card in the deck that's over $1.50 though, if that makes you feel a little bit better. You know, and you can always move the Harsh Mentors out of the side if you want to save like $3.50. Not bad at all. So really, really cheap deck to play that, given the chance to develop its board slightly, if you just get like 2 or even 3 Archers or Alchemists out, then you'll kill them quicker than you might think. You know, if you can untap with 2 Archers or an Alchemist and an Archer out, and you've got a couple of cards in hand, well, suddenly you're just dealing 10 damage, like out of nowhere. It's ridiculous. So give this deck a shot. I think it can actually do a fair amount of work for you up at F&M, especially after you get in some reps for it. It can be a little difficult to figure out how you're supposed to play this deck at first, but some pro tips are just draw as many cards as you possibly can, even if you don't have an Archer or Alchemist out, you know, because you're trying to draw into them at that point. Just use your draw card spells, and also kill creatures whenever you can, you know, because this deck actually doesn't win until turn 5 to 7, or even later a lot of the time. So you got to keep creatures off your back. If you're wondering whether you should kill a guy or go to the dome, usually kill a guy is the right answer. And yeah, I know the deck looks a little bit weird, but once you draw like 3 cards in a turn with all your spells, and you deal a bunch of damage with Alchemist and Archer, and then you play like an Incendiary Flow on that same turn and deal a bunch of damage, you know, you'll just, I'm telling you guys, you can deal 12 damage like easier than you think. There's so many setups, especially with Insult to Injury, that you can sometimes just kill them out of nowhere. They didn't account for it. They didn't know they were going to take 12 on the next turn. So try this thing out. It's better than you might think. But an important question is, what are we doing next time? Well, I'm going to give you a choice between 2 popular decks. These have been pretty popular when I've asked you about them before. Do you either want to see the red-black aggro deck that I'm working on? I've almost did that deck. Really, 8 Alchemists was neck and neck with that deck in a comments section. I gave you a choice between it and green-red ramp and Alchemist. And really, red-black aggro was winning for like 2 whole days, and the thermo-alchemist pulled ahead towards the end. But I can show you that red-black aggro deck, which was actually was represented somewhat at the SCG Open in Cincinnati, the first tournament of the season. That deck got registered a couple of times, and that made me happy. So I can show you that deck. It's pretty powerful. It can win you some games. Or I can show you my horse. But for now, if you enjoyed the content, just hit the thumbs up button. That helps me out. You can subscribe. If you haven't done that yet, what are you doing? Subscribe. Go ahead and do it. Hit the bell for the notifications too. So whenever I put out deck techs, you'll see that. You can follow us on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG. If you're already a $5 or more Patreon, just letting you know that I'm going to try to get these signed cards out to you on the 24th of this month is when I'm going to try and send these out. So be looking for them. Later on this month, you will get them. I promise. But anyway, if you like the deck, give it a shot and make sure you vote on what we're doing next time. I'm Dev from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.